Welcome everybody to the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment. Tonight we're very fortunate to have an extremely experienced musician in our midst. We have Kurt Harlan Larson, as I'm sure all of you know and are familiar with his work at the Information Society and with various game companies from across the world, from X-Men to Soul Reaver. And without further ado, Kurt.
Well, I had some stuff written out on a piece of paper, but I think I just remembered it all because it was very little. I'm going to go really casual here because I'm talking to 7 people, 8, plus Isabel and
I don't count.
Alex. You guys. You've already heard all this bullshit. In case you're not sure what you stumbled into, I do audio for games, and I've done a lot of music, and some of the games I've worked on are here. So Alex invited me to come and talk about some of that. So, as some of you may know, I started working in a band in 1982 when I was only 19, called Information Society, and I did nothing but that as a career for the first, like 12 years after that. And as the major label record contract days were winding down, and I moved to San Francisco because although I was going to continue doing some of that work, I really wanted to get into game audio. Because doing music for video games in 1994 was a profoundly arcane, wizardly art. Was anyone here working with games in 94 or earlier? The music, doing music on a Sega Genesis was really intensely strange. You had to... I had a Genesis that the game company gave me, and you know how the slot where you put in the cartridges? I had to put in a circuit board. They just gave me, here's this circuit board about this big, jam it into the slot. It was not this one exactly, but it was one very much like this. See it says Sega there? And you just go, and you put it into the top of the thing. And then here's a Centronics connector. It's not actually in there, but you get the idea. I remember this was hard to get it to fit in properly. I can unhook bras and put circuit boards into Genesis. And then you had to connect this Centronics cable, which is what we used to use for SCSI. Who remembers SCSI? Yeah, okay.
Sexy.
Yeah. And plug this into the parallel port of my computer, which was being used for my MIDI interface. And that is how I could use a sequencer. I was using Voyager's Sequencer Plus Gold at the time to actually play the music system in the Genesis. And the music system in the Genesis was based on Timex, right? Timex made the Z80?
Oh, yeah.
Timex chip called the Z80, which was also the core of the Sinclair?
Yep.
Yeah, you remember the Timex Sinclair? Well, they pulled the main chip out of that and stuck it into the Sega Genesis. There's one in there. Alex, this is awesome. Can you just keep doing that? And then I had an ingot of platinum. So they pulled out the Z80 from a Timex Sinclair, which, as you remember, was like a 1981 device. And they jammed it into the Sega Genesis, and that was the music chip. The Genesis, everything else ran on a Motorola 68000, which needs no introduction, of course. But the music chip was running on a Timex Z80. And it had a music chip, and the music chip was 6-voice, 4-operator FM. Raise your hand if you don't know what I mean by 6-voice. Raise your hand if you don't count. Raise your hand if you don't know what I mean by 4-operator FM. Okay, FM is frequency modulation, and it's a type of synthesis. Some synthesizers are FM synthesizers. I won't go into the details, but it's just a way of making synthetic sound in musical instruments, which is how the music chip in the Genesis worked. And 4-operator is another detail of that, which I also won't go into, but it's like how many operators you have defines the complexity of the sounds you can make. 6-voice 4-operator is very small. It's very low capability. So before anyone had come up with terms like circuit bending or chip music, it was profoundly challenging for anyone with any kind of music credentials to even think about. There are very, 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 very few people who had demonstrable musical experience and accomplishment, which I had at the time, and were willing to even think about the stuff I was just telling you. That was not the Venn diagram for those things is extremely small overlap. So it was very easy for me to get into music for games at the time. That all stopped when they put CD drives into gaming devices like the PlayStation 1. As soon as that happened, all the developers realized, hey, we can just stream music off this CD drive. And suddenly, like, wow, it can sound like real music. We don't have to listen. And now, 20 years later, we're all going, oh, we got to get some of that old music that sounded like that. Once you could make music come off the CD, well, all you needed to do was deliver a WAV file. Like, here's the music. I just recorded it at home. I made a dead recording, and there it is. It's in the game. Now, suddenly, I have no special skills and no especially desirable credentials at all. In fact, I was not even all that good compared to guys who were cranking out advertising music and television music and, God forbid, film music all the time anyway. So my involvement in music for video games really only lasted until, actually it kind of dragged on until like 2003, but it really started to go downhill towards the end of the 90s when streaming CD music gained ascendance. So I started to reposition myself more into working in-house with my fingers in the game, like wiring stuff up, making it work, and I actually enjoyed that a lot more. But I'm going to back up a little bit more into the music, because before all music became streamed, like it is now, it was all live rendered, by which I mean that the way they would do it is the composer would deliver MIDI files, which would usually get translated into some kind of proprietary version of a MIDI file, and a bunch of sounds. And then at runtime, you'd load the MIDI file into memory, and you'd load the wave data into memory, and the game would actually be playing the sound. The game would function as a sequencer. All that stuff was live. If the frame rate slowed down and you didn't set it up properly, your music could slow down. So I'm going to play a piece of music for you that was from Soul Reaver 1. All right, this is only 2 minutes long, so I'm going to make you listen to it.
Turn down the volume of VLC.
It's clipping. It's overdriving the input, okay?
Yeah, put that back in 100. And just use the amp.
Thank you. Skyrim theme song. So the reason I wanted to play that for you is because
The main.
that entire song, and actually there's more to it than that, that was one of 4 layers that could play. It would switch over to a whole new set of tracks for 3 other modes, depending on what was going on in the game. And that recording you heard, plus 3 other fairly different modes for that same song, all fit with its MIDI data into less than 105 kilobytes. Do you remember the word kilo? Remember when we used K?
I remember the word MIDI.
185,000 bytes. Hey, Alex. Thanks for coming. And, I mean, you heard that. It sounds lush. Clearly, doesn't sound like a film soundtrack that you're used to now, and it was only a 2-minute loop. But it had 4 totally different modes that it would shift into. And it did everything you just heard. And all the MIDI data and all the wave data all fit into less than 185 kilobytes. This was the black art that we had to do. Now, Alex Rudis, who just walked in, was doing the same thing at the same time. In fact, I did my very first job for him in '94, summer of '94, for a Scooby-Doo game. Did that ever come out?
Yeah, it did. That's on Genesis.
Yeah. What else was going on in '94 besides Genesis?
Sneeze.
Sneeze, right. I'm sorry, I forgot. It was Sneeze and Genesis.
Yeah, and then I think there was still a little bit of legacy guitar stuff that still happened.
The Jaguar hadn't come out yet, had it?
That's right around.
We were right on the edge of the era of 3DO and Dreamcast, but it all had to be pulled out after the Savoy Truffle. I mean, the PlayStation hit, which pretty much dominated the industry after that. And that's when the CD went into. Now, the Genesis obviously had a CD attachment that came later, but it was an afterthought, and it didn't change the industry. It was the PlayStation that changed to CDs, where instead of, oh, how are we going to fit all this music into 185K and live render it out during game time, it was just, well, stream it off the disc. Oddly enough, nonetheless, as late as 2002, I was still doing, 2003 even, I was still doing live rendered music at Crystal Dynamics, but it was a dying art. And in fact, when I got fired, one of the things that the guy who let me go said was, look, we're just not going to do that live rendered music anymore. It's just not mainstream. And he was right. You can make mainstream sounding music using a live rendered system, but why would you bother, really? So that's sort of the end of that particular tangent about how a change in technology totally changes the way art is done. I could come up with a million examples of that from things outside the game industry too, but I'm sure you've all thought of them already. So let me show you a little bit about the kind of stuff I'm doing when I'm not working on music in games. Now all I do with music is music direction and implementation. Like a few years ago I was working at a place called Gazillion in San Mateo, and as the audio director there, one of the things I had to do was sort of manage the stable of 6 composers that we had for this MMO that we were pretending to actually think we were ever going to ship, which we never did. And that was, I found it was almost more gratifying than having to do the damn music myself. So, here's a story about John Romero. Who doesn't know who John Romero is? John Romero is a legendary game designer behind, one of the people behind Doom.
That's basically it.
I'm not going to say anymore. So, one of my very first meetings this is when I learned about what John is like. One of my very first meetings at Gazillion after I got hired, we had like 9 people in the room who were all like really smart, intense game designer people. And then me, and then John. And they're all talking about really deep, difficult shit about how to make this game. The conversation was very serious and was going on for a long time. We were talking about this object that we had in our game that somebody called the astrolabe, because it looks a little bit like an orrery, but the person who was trying to think of it got the words mixed up and called it an astrolabe. Didn't look anything like an astrolabe, but that's what he came up with. So it's a portal. It's where people spawn in an area. And the big conversation was about, can we have more than one astrolabe within a certain subdivision of our data? So after about 10 minutes of that, John goes, so two of them? Would that be called astrolabia? So that's my John Romero story. And John, I hope you see this someday and appreciate that I'm propagating your sense of humor. If I design a sound, or let's say a set of sounds, I'm doing one of the 2 things. I'm actually making a sound, like here. I spent 5 minutes, and because I did that, there's a WAV file that exists now that didn't exist before. I made a sound. I designed a sound. A higher definition of the term would be, I sat around and thought and used my experience, if I have any, and talent, if I have any, to think, well, we should probably go about these sounds in this way. Let's make these kinds of sounds and set them up like that and record them in this way and implement them in that way. That's designing the sound approach. But generally, a sound designer is responsible for delivering WAV files. He's usually the same person as the implementer, and the implementer has to take those assets and get in and start doing, software design. He may not be a computer programmer, probably isn't, but he's got to use the tools, he's got to work with the programmers, work with the designers, work with the producers, work with the animators to do all the proprietary stuff or non-proprietary stuff that the company for which he works is doing. Today, for example, I spent the whole damn day with Alex, because he and I are working together on a project right now, trying to reduce the amount of memory that we were using with our sounds, because suddenly last week some stuff went down that totally bloated our RAM usage unexpectedly. We didn't know it was going to happen, and now we had to fix it. So we're like looking at how everything's set up across like 9 different tools and going, well, if I remove this here and edit that XML file and then rebuild this and then change those animation tags, then I can remove these sounds and then memory will come down. That's implementation. And sound implementation, you're usually not going to be working in an audio tool, you're going to be working in a text editor. You're going to be editing XML, or you're going to be working with the company's proprietary tools to like find little objects and change the values of parameters and stuff to make the sounds actually behave properly. Let me use your question as a branch off for a tangent, because this is my huge foot-stomping thing that I was going to say to anyone who was here because they wanted to find out how to work in game audio, even though that's not the case. But it's relevant to what you're saying, sort of. The design of audio is maybe 20% of the work and 3% of defining how it's going to, the quality of the final result. 97% of the quality of the final result is implementation. Many of you may have been exposed to the paradigm that came up in the 80s as SSL boards were made, that the mixing board is the instrument. Has anyone heard anyone blather on about that? It was a really popular concept that came up in the 80s as mixing technology got really explosively huge and advanced. The tracks on the tapes became the raw material, and the mixing board and the mixing studio became the instrument that you played, because you could do so much with the mixing boards. You could make the same tapes sound like 10 different songs. In the same sense, implementation of your audio assets into the game is like that mixing board. You can make them suck or you can make them sound right. And the anecdote I was going to tell is the very first sound design job I ever did in my life. I was still living in New York. It was 1992, and a friend of mine worked at a company that was making this little computer application that was meant to go into a kiosk at a medical convention. And it was so doctors could be marketed to by doing this little application thing where you tried to make the drug molecules zap out the germs. And it needed about 20 sounds. So they paid me a couple $100 to give them 20 sounds, and I didn't hear anything back, and I asked my friend, so how did that work out? And he said, well, not very well. They were upset that your sounds were so bad. I thought, oh, you know, it really upset me. Like, it was the very first time I'd ever done anything outside of the band for money since college, so I was thinking, failed! The world hates me. And I started to ask, well, what happened? I thought I better figure out what went wrong. Well, here's what went wrong. I wasn't there to implement them. I just handed them 20 wave files, which were all at 22 kilohertz to fit into memory. Now, nobody there had any understanding of audio whatsoever, so they just plugged them in. And they played back at 44 kilohertz. Yeah. So everyone was complaining that the sounds were all tinny and too short. So, you see, no matter how good of a sound designer you are, you're not the one in control of the quality of the final result, which is what the user hears. And that's why I really wanted to and went to work on the game itself. That's where the quality actually is manifested or not. So here's an example of stuff I do. A big thing in game audio is limited resources, just like everything in game is dealing with limited resources, of course. But what we all learned in the 90s and O's was that there's terribly limited resources. Now our resources are only limited, not terribly limited. Like, we have 26 megs for audio on this project right now. 26 megabytes just for audio. I mean, it's amazing. We used to have 500K, or less. So the most important thing was to figure out how can we get variety of the playback sound without using a whole lot of memory, because what makes game audio irritating and it makes people turn it off so often is that it's highly repetitious. You get one sound that plays exactly the same 50,000 times if you play that game a lot. And you get sick of it and you don't want to hear it anymore. So you look for ways to get a lot of variety out of not so much memory. For example, here we have my equalization split matrix explosion. What we've got here is a single sound represented in an audio middleware tool called Fmod, made by the good people at Firelight in Australia. There we go. I shrunk it down so it fits on the screen. The game for which I made this had tons and tons of explosions, big-ass explosions, and they happened a lot. So, if the MMO that never shipped. So you can't run out and run and find it. If I had just put in a few explosion sounds and been reasonable on the memory, in about 10 minutes you would have heard all of them 3 times, and a month later, when you're still playing the MMO, you would be reaching for the sound out, because you wouldn't want to hear them ever again. If I put in 5,000 variants, well, then you're shipping, a hard drive with your game to carry all the wave data. So what I did is I took 8 explosions, just 8. Really good ones. Like, I spent time designing those. They're fairly long, they're fairly big, and I made them really good. But there's only 8 of them. No matter how good they are, you can't listen to the same 8 explosions for months or years. People play MMOs for 10 years. I played EverQuest for, geez, I have 7,000 hours on my main alone. So I took those 8 and I came up with 5 equalization bands. Who doesn't know what equalization bands means? I took each explosion and made 5 copies. And I filtered out everything except the very highs in one of them. And everything except the kind of highs in a second. Middle, kind of low, and low. So I ended up with 5 copies of the same sound across 5 different frequency bands. For example, here's the very high one of number 1, and the kind of high, and the mid, and the low, and the super low. Now, if you put all 5 of those back together, it would sound quite a bit like the original explosion sound that I made. But remember, I did this with 8 different sounds, 40 total. Took 8 sounds, divided them up into 5 separated equalized bands. Then I set this Fmod event up to select one of those 8 for each of the frequency bands. So here, it'll go and pick one out of, at random, it'll pick one out of the 8 low, one out of the 8 kind of low, one out of the 8 mid, kind of high, and high. And then it mixes them together. So you get the super low from number 1, the kind of low from number 7, the mid from number 4, etc. And okay, so there's an explosion sound. It doesn't sound like much, but you'll notice every time I hit this button, it's different. Button all night, and you can record the output, and you can write a program to analyze the output, and it's a 2 to 15, it's 32,768 variations. So if you push this button 32,768 times, you have about 1 minus 1 over e chance of hearing the exact same sound twice once. That's important because it has to be recognizable. The player needs to know what the sound he's hearing is supposed to represent. Oh yeah, that's a big explosion. But it'll never engage that part of your brain that identifies exact regularity, because that is a highly meaningful thing to the brain. And the brain tracks it, and it's extremely distracting. And if you're trying to think about gameplay, this thing I'm doing with my hand is incredibly annoying. And this is why people turn off sound in games. So a lot of our work, not so much now as it used to be, but a lot of our work is figuring out tricky ways to use a reasonable amount of assets to do a very large amount of variety. And that's a very good example of what sound design is. Now, sound design implementation starts when you're done making this. So I've got this sound here in Fmod. Well, the game doesn't know about it. Anybody who ever talks to me about getting into game audio, I tell them, well, you need to get yourself a really good text editor. That's way more important than knowing how to use Pro Tools, in my opinion, if you're going to work in-house as an implementer. Now, a lot of people are working as outsourced providers, and of course, they are able to pretty much limit themselves to working with audio tools only if they so choose. I saved a much more impressive looking one than this that's like 500 lines. It was one of the player banks. 500 lines of handwritten XML that's just full of gobbledygook and weird shit, to scare everybody. But here's a simpler one. This, for example, is what we do to mix the game. Not any tags, VO, info, and, not all, tags, player, weapons, game, pitch. This, to anyone who codes, is recognizable as a formal language syntax. You'll recognize the syntax of a formal language. Not any means that in the following list, you have to select out things that don't have that VO or info, and also that don't have both player and weapons, and then take all the results and perform this operation, which is cutting the volume in half, and this operation, which is to drop the pitch down 5. This is what game audio implementation is. I mean, we're not sitting around in beautiful audio rooms playing acoustic instruments into a microphone. We're doing stuff like this and then going over to our programmers and going, Avery, why doesn't this work? Because we're not really programmers ourselves in most cases. But stuff like this is why it was very helpful for me anyway to have gone through computer science education in college. Because by the time this stuff started, I had to start dealing with this stuff. Well, it wasn't foreign to me. I was able to look at it and go, oh, I sort of understand what this sort of thing is. I couldn't originate new... this, for example, is not XML. It's inside an XML tag, but this, it breaks out into some kind of code parser that my programmer gave me. I couldn't originate new stuff like that without coordinating with all the other programmers, and I'm not allowed to because that's not my job. But I can look at this stuff and go, all right, if that one works like that, I can probably write one myself and put it right next to it, and that'll work. Mixing. Who here has ever done mixing work on audio? Okay, so there's a sort of holy grail among a lot of game audio guys that they want mixing on games to be the same as mixing in an audio studio. Apparently I'm a bit of an anomaly because I just don't see the appeal. I don't really want that. But there's a great deal of work going on to try to create that. FMUD, which I've been showing you here, has a new product and sort of new version out called Studio, and they were bragging, for example, about how you can use an SSL board to mix a game as the game is running if you set it up right. And I'll say two things about that. First, not without a whole hell of a lot of code support from the programmers on that game that they are not going to want to do and is not going to be in their schedule. Two, I don't really see the advantage, but most game audio people do, and so it's probably important. But let me show you what mixing video games is actually really like. This file up here contains a bunch of numbers next to words like objects, SFX, VO, music, announcer, info, right? And they're all next to numbers. Here's 1, 1.4, 0.50. Those numbers represent volumes on a scale of 0 to 2. The words are tags that are attached to every single sound that is in the game. A sound might just say SFX, or it might say SFX and weapons and player and Foley and no pause. And you go in here, you set those numbers, you change them around so that those groups of sounds change their volumes. Every time I make an edit in this, I have to save it, go to a DOS box, run a command, and thank God I can hotload it, which you don't always have, so I don't have to rerun the game. And it changes the volume in game. That's how a AAA big budget game, even in this era, is generally mixed. It's something like this. Game audio is really nothing like pure audio in terms of its workflow if you work in-house. The only people working on game audio who are doing it in a recognizable way, recognizable to pure audio people, are the people who are providing assets only. There are companies like, for example, Somatone in San Francisco, who mostly will make a bunch of audio assets and deliver them. I believe they also are totally ready to offer implementation help as well, but generally outsourced companies are pretty much just delivering assets.
So, when we talk about Soul Reaver?
That's Soul Reaver 2, right? Soul Reaver 2 was interesting because it was it was a game that was right on the cusp, right on a big transition between the sort of old fiddly way that games used to be made and the more higher resources, a little bit slicker but much less efficient and kind of sloppy way that games are made now. I didn't mean that to sound pejorative. If you don't have to be efficient, you shouldn't be, because being efficient is a lot of work and it takes time. Okay, here's a good tangent to go off on. Instead of talking about Soul Reaver, it's been really interesting for me, working in the games industry for 19 years now, 18, watching how the bottleneck has moved. At first, the bottleneck was almost all memory, and to a lesser extent, processing power. There's just no memory available for anything. I don't know how much the Genesis had anymore, but I think it was it 500K or a meg? It was, let's just say that your USB stick that you have on your keychain probably has between 2,000 and 4,000 times as much memory as the Sega Genesis had. And then later on, it became all about processing power, because the expectations for what things were going to look like went up when everything went over into 3D rendering. Suddenly it had to look really, really, really great, and now you just don't have the processing power, so then they had to add GPU chips in, and then it became storage. Suddenly you just couldn't fit enough on the damn disk. Your game had to be on one disk, and it just keeps moving around. Now, the biggest bottleneck is time. You just, yes, you could be more efficient, right? But the Sony Vita, which I'm working on now, which is basically the PSP2, if you've heard of it. It has, what, half a gig of RAM, I think? It has 512 megabytes of RAM. So we're just wasting RAM left and right. I mean, we have stuff in there that we don't even, and the storage medium is like tons and tons of gigabytes. On this game, we're probably going to ship almost a gig of junk that the game isn't using because it's too time consuming and too dangerous to remove it. Because when you take something out, it's like 2 days later that you found out that you broke the build as a result, because something's still asking for it even though we don't really need it. The bottleneck now is time, because time is money. So Soul Reaver 2 at the time was in a really interesting transition where the bottlenecks were changing from memory to processing power.
Isn't the PlayStation 2 a real pain to develop for it? I mean, you had a reputation with launch.
I believe a programmer would be able to answer that question more intelligently than I. If I limit my answer to the audio perspective, it was quite liberating. People were still willing to do live rendered music at the time, although that was going away. But we had way more memory. When they made the transition from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2, our memory went up from 500 kilobytes to 2 whole megs. It had to contain all of the MIDI data too, but still, that was a lot. So it wasn't too bad. The interesting transitions around that time, though, had to do with the fact that the PlayStation 2, it wasn't dead yet, but it was starting to become mature, and the expectations were going up and up and up. So it was getting harder and harder and harder to make a game for the PlayStation 2, mostly because everyone expected it to be really, really awesome. People were figuring out how to wring the lateral drop of everything out of it. In fact, that was a big problem for me in Soul Reaver 2, because they figured out how to stream animations through the audio I/O circuits. Because then you can have more animations. And it caused horrible problems for audio, and we had to scale back the audio design as a result. That was interesting. I don't know how many people here know that, but the lead designer on that game and the creative director for that game were Richard LaMarche and Amy Hennig. Anyone recognize those names from other games? Well, they were 2 of the 3 main people who designed the Uncharted series recently. Richard has very recently, like in the last couple months, gone on, he left the industry to become a game design professor at USC. So the Soul Reaver 2 is kind of an amazing game when you look at the roster of talent that was involved in it. I really like the Soul Reaver series because musically it gave me an opportunity to make really moody stuff. In fact, the reason I got the Soul Reaver 1 job in the first place is that a song that I had done for my solo album in 1997 called Don't Be Afraid, a song called Ozar Midrashim, had caught the attention of Amy Hennig, who was the creative director, and she said, "This is the kind of music I want in this game. We got to get this guy, right?" And that wasn't why I made that song, right? But it became the theme song for Soul Reaver 1, and another variant on another song that I did became the theme song for Soul Reaver 2. And the mandate was to make really, really dark, moody, atmospheric, ethereal music. And at the time, I was doing Soul Reaver 1, it was 1998, it was still the case that most game music, at least most game music that anyone knew, was really blippy, really beepy, really choppy, really upbeat, very poppy, kind of constantly jammering at your head. It was a Japanese-driven art form to a large extent. It was expected. People conform to what other people are doing. Most people do. And so she was in a position to introduce a contrast, and she really wanted music that was just... I thought, I can do it. So that was really fun, making the music for that game. Also, the interactivity was very fun. Interactivity in game music has largely fallen into the ditch. When it was live rendered, you could do all kinds of bizarre crap. You could change the tempo, you could tie the tempo of the music to the speed of your vehicle. You could change the key of the music to the time of day. You know, I had something set up at Gazillion where we made this adaptive generative music system, and the time of day was going to change the key and the mode of the automatic music generation system. That game never shipped. The one that never shipped?
Yeah.
It was an MMO for kids, like age 10, with a strong educational layer.
Explosion.
Yeah, lots of basically, we were tricking them into doing math. You get an object, and if you want to open that box, well, you have to do basically an algebra problem that had been mapped onto some manipulable three-dimensional objects, but there were no numbers on the screen. So all the kids knew is that they had to move the objects around in a certain way to get the box to open, and the people who designed the puzzle came from a background of having an education. They had graduated with degrees in education for children, so they came up with all these tricky puzzles. That's what that game was about. Back to Soul Reaver 2, the interactivity in that music was really fun because we had all these different layers of MIDI tracks that would turn on and off depending on things like whether there were any enemies around at all, whether the enemies were aggroed on you, time of day. But the game after Soul Reaver, to branch away from Soul Reaver for a second, was called Whiplash, and that was way more fun because the interactivity on that one was based on user input. If you put the controller down and left it for 45 seconds or something, it would go into this sort of hibernation mode, and it would just play one percussion track and a little bit of a bass track, and that was it. As soon as you pick the controller up and give it any input at all, push one button, move any joystick, anything, it would pick back up into a different mode. So it would like greet you when you come back. The game was mostly about breaking stuff. The more stuff you break, the more it would elevate into more manic modes. That kind of interactivity in music is generally not being done now. And the reason is because of the CD drive, or well, what used to be the CD drive and is now whatever medium you're using. Now that you can just stream the music, that kind of live rendered stuff is just not happening anymore. It's too hard to get the kind of interactivity that you could get in Soul Reaver 2 using streaming music. There's a combinatorial explosion problem with the tracks, and there is a seek time and response time issue with the tracks. You can't keep them beat matched anymore like you could when there was all RAM resident. In other words, kids today, man, kids today. Soul Reaver 2 was decreed a failure by its publisher because it did not sell to Target. I mean, it's one of the reasons IDOS ended up having to sell themselves to CMI, somebody?
Elevation Partners.
That was later, I think. I really don't know to whom they sold it, so I thought I was going to remember that name, and I don't. Because it came out about 9 months after it was supposed to. And the people in the publishing department said, if this had come out 9 months ago, we would have sold 800,000 more copies than we did, and it made the difference between it making as much money as they needed it to and not. I throw this in there because it's a good reminder. I'm sure you've all encountered this kind of thing yourselves, but it's another example of the difference between how we live through things and how we remember them. Because we got a few people in this room looking back at Soul Reaver 2 and just thinking, wow, that was so great. This is such an accomplishment. That must have been really cool. I bet everyone was really happy with that game. Well, in its day, all it was a project that failed to save IDOS that quarter. And that's how it was understood at the time, and not much else. Dose of cold water in reality here.
Was there a really bad crunch on that one in the last 8 minutes? Or?
It's been long enough, and Crystal Dynamics has been through essentially a complete shutdown and rebirth. I think I can unleash my tongue. One of the terrible things about working at Crystal Dynamics was that they had this culture of infinite crunch. It was when I learned, along with a lot of my colleagues, that the human capacity for crunch mode is about 6 to 12 weeks long. And then we found out what happens after those 12 weeks. And what happens is people keep working 16 hours a day. But they don't do 16 hours of work anymore. What they've done is they're living at work. So they work for 8 hours, and then for the other 8 hours at work, they're getting their laundry done, they're going out to dinner, they're reading, they're watching movies on their computers, which was harder to do back then, but we were starting to do it. The only thing that had changed is that instead of working 8 hours and then going home, you're working 8 hours and then not going home. That's what happens after 3 months of crunch. And we crunched for like 20 months on that project. It drove a lot of people crazy. We would just sort of keep extending the schedule whenever we didn't accomplish something that Amy wanted accomplished. Now, Amy did 2 things on that game. She was the creative director. She was pretty much in charge of what the game was and what it was supposed to become. She made something timelessly memorable that 20 years from now, 50 years from now, people are still going to look back at that game if they can find a way to play it, like maybe by coming to a game museum. And they're going to say, wow, this was really great. This must have been an awesome project to work on. What a great work of art. And that's because she just kept pushing and pushing and pushing for things to be bigger and better and more wonderful. But the other thing it's going to be remembered for is, it sucked to work on that project. And it ruined a lot of people's lives for a long time, and it failed to meet, like I said, it failed to meet its economic targets as a result.
Do you crunch anymore? Do you allow yourself to?
I am crunching today. In other words, I'm not supposed to be here. I slept at my office on Saturday night. And I'm 49 years old. I mean, that's just embarrassing. If you're 26 and you're going, oh, I'm working in the games industry, and you're single, and you live with 3 roommates and you pay $500 rent. Well, that's pretty cool, man. I slept at the office because I'm working on game audio. But if you're 49 and you have 2 children and a whole real life and you're sleeping at the office, that's just embarrassing.
It doesn't have to be that way, does it?
No, and as any of you who are working in the game industry have seen over the last 10 years, there's been a strong cultural shift in this country away from doing that. What I find very interesting about that is the rise of overseas developers, especially in Asia, because every industry has seen this happen. Here, we keep elevating our standards of living, which means keeping the work contained. And eventually it goes overseas where people are working 20-hour days and living in bunkers for $2 an hour. That could happen to us too. There are a lot of Chinese and Korean people who work on game development. The only thing that keeps them from getting my job is cultural communication problems that make it difficult for somebody here who wants to develop a game that's going to sell to Americans to simply farm it out to Korea. But they're getting better and better at doing it. Look at animation. As I'm not an animator, but my understanding is that for film and television, almost all cells are painted, if there's any such thing as painted cells anymore, that they are all painted in Korea. That could happen to us too, in which case, no, we're not crunching anymore, but that's because we don't have jobs. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a they took our jobs fanatic, but it ties into the question of quality of life issues in the games industry, which, as most of you have seen, has been a big topic for us in the last 10 years. In fact, I worked directly with and sat 2 cubes away from the guy who started the lawsuit against EA, for which the EA spouse writings are well known. I talked to him about it extensively, and it was his perspective on it was interesting because he was not some firebrand revolutionary. Honestly, he got into it, he said, because, well, in order to get this claim that I wanted to get some money paid back for a bunch of overtime that I did, my lawyer said I had to do this, so I had to file a report, and that became officially a thing that went into some legal action. He had no idea where it was going. He was just like kind of trying to go through the bureaucracy, and it blew up into this big lawsuit. I also got when I was there, I got the letter that explained what his response was. It's basically, they said, there were two things really interesting about it. One is, they basically said, well, okay, we're going to comply with all of this for qualified employees, who turned out to be only producers and execs.
Ooh.
Everybody else was like classified as I don't remember the term.
Peon.
That may have been it. Hamster, possibly. The other thing I remember about it is that they gave there was this whole paragraph that was just this petulant, passive-aggressive, trying to sound chipper description of what the problem was. Obviously, they're not going to send out a letter that's going to go public, because it went to every employee in EA, that's just really bitchy. But they wanted to get their point across, which was that they felt that this was not right and it was not fair, and that people were simply misunderstanding. So what they said is that apparently the opposing side here does not understand the garage developer mentality of the games industry. They tried to evoke that concept of like, oh, it's so cool, we're three guys in college making a game, we're going to stay up all night. This is a worldwide company with billions in assets and thousands of employees and stock that's been on the stock market for years and years and years, and they're trying to evoke the can-do attitude of the college students pulling an all-nighter. I was profoundly amused and very glad that I was only a temporary contractor there at the time, because that was BS, man.
So if you could work on any game, what would it be?
Journey.
Yeah.
Oh, God. If I could work at that game company, I would stop considering leaving the industry. How many people here have played any of the following three: Flow, Flower, and Journey? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. These are some, for the people who haven't seen them, these are some beautiful games made by a company in Southern California called That Game Company, which their design approach is to make their games very relaxed and kind of not in your face. You have to pick up the game and kind of just engage it, and it doesn't then hit you with specific challenges and direct goals and instructions, but rather an environment in which you just do stuff. In Flower, you are the wind, and you can blow around. You tilt the controller and the wind goes, and you pick up flower petals. And eventually you realize that sometimes when you blow over certain things, they kind of open up, and you realize that if you open up everything in a certain area, it makes the whole landscape bloom into color. And you say, hey, apparently I'm rejuvenating the landscape. If that occurs to you. If it doesn't, you can keep playing it. Journey is something they came out with not that long ago, and you're set down in the middle of a desert. You've got this little character, a very abstracted looking character, and in the distance there's a mountain. And you can go to the mountain if you choose to. And if you don't, well, then you're not going to play. And that's all there is to it. And on the way, you just kind of open up the environment and unlock things. There's no dialogue in any of their games, which I really love, because I have to process VO all day long. I mean, games have 50,000 VO files in them, and that gets very tiresome. So yes, that's what I would want to work on. Or, you know what else I want to work on is another MMO. I really enjoyed playing MMOs in my life. I'm a big MMO fan, and so it's enjoyable for me to work on that kind of game too, just because I've spent so much time playing them. And MMOs are a deep, deep, deep audio design challenge, because you have these big environments shared by lots of people that are persistent. And people spend huge amounts of time in them. You want them to be lush and immersive and engaging, but the huge amount of time spent listening to the same sounds comes up against that limited resource question again, and that's like one of my areas of creative expertise, is how do I get a lot of variety out of very little resources. So MMOs are also kind of a game I'd love to work on. Somebody other than Mr. Handy for a change? Anything? Yes?
That Soul Reaver MP3 you played a while back, that sounds really good for being MIDI, you said? It's all MIDI?
I'm going to say yes and then come back and say more about that.
Okay, my question is, if that's MIDI, what synth or synths did you use to render that? Because that sounds
Exactly.
great.
Well, the sounds were, I just made actual sound files, right? So they're what you would call samples. if that answers your question.
Uh-huh.
The PlayStation did not have a synthesizer in it, unlike the Genesis. I described the 4-operator 6-voice FM chip in the Genesis. That was a synthesizer. The Genesis ships with a tiny little synthesizer built in. The PlayStation did not. The PlayStation has the ability to play back samples. So I made a set of samples that had to fit inside that 185K limit, minus the MIDI data, which was about 25K. And the MIDI file plays the samples.
So it's kind of like you built sort of like a tracker, I guess?
If I understand the meaning of that term, yes, but I might be misunderstanding it. So I'll
like
say
a mod
I think
file
yes.
from the Amiga
Yeah,
days.
mods were kind of after my time.
I see.
But yeah, I mean, it's what you would call a wavetable.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I want to go back to what you said when you asked, is it MIDI music? That's a very interesting term, MIDI music, because I've had to talk to people about that phrase, MIDI music, lots and lots and lots of times. And it's an interesting phrase because it doesn't mean anything. If you try to define MIDI music, there is no functional definition that actually works or means anything. What people mean when they say it is the music that I know of that happened before we started streaming. And typically you would use MIDI files. You didn't have to, but typically you would use MIDI files, translate them into a smaller version inside the game, and use them to play back sounds out of your wavetable. It was called MIDI music, meaning that whole method of live rendered music. So I always call it live rendered, which kind of actually tells you something about what's happening.
Yeah, MIDI's kind of the language. I mean, most
MIDI
people
is
just confuse MIDI
protocol.
with the cheesy, tinny sounds that came out of your
Yes,
cheap sound
that
card.
was general MIDI.
Yeah.
And general MIDI was nothing more than some people got together and said, what do we got, 7 bits? Let's write down a list of 128 types of sounds and associate them with 128 numbers, and then we'll all agree. We'll just get together and agree that number 44 means violins,
Nobody agreed on
cello
the
section.
samples, though.
What?
Nobody agreed on the samples, too.
But you didn't need to. As long as your number 44 was somewhere in the ballpark of being a cello section, well, then the music that came out of it would sort of be in the ballpark. Of course, it was really fun to put the same MIDI file through all these different general MIDI sets, but that was actually kind of the fun of it, is that, hey, I'm going to make a general MIDI set that sounds like this. But what you didn't get from that was reliable sameness of quality across different platforms. You'd make some music, it would sound fine on your general MIDI set, but then on this general MIDI set over here, it sounded like crap.
Mm-hmm.
That was the problem with it. It was a nice dream, but I told day one it wasn't going to work. So yeah, it got a very bad reputation because people use the term MIDI music to mean all of the stuff that we got sick of before we started being able to stream properly recorded studio music.
It's mostly related. What are you enjoying as far as music goes right now?
Like
listening-
development of game music, or even just
No,
listening to music?
Just listening and
yeah,
specifically electronic.
KMFDM, Leibach. Leibach has a great album from about 7 years ago called What? One of the songs of which, B Machina, was used almost as the sole story platform for the recent movie Iron Sky, which isn't out in this country yet, but I have a copy of it because I'm so cool. If I'm working, I like to have music on, and I can't be listening to that kind of stuff usually. Usually my tasks require too much brain power, so I just put on a lot of Brian Eno, a lot of Roger Eno, a lot of Michael Whalen, Harold Budd, a lot of ambient, lightweight background stuff. Or I'll just take, recently I took 2 measures from an old OMD song and dropped them down a couple octaves and just ran that for a couple of hours. Things like that. I also am still listening to a great deal of goth industrial club music when I'm doing something that doesn't require too much bandwidth. I was like Susie and Cocteau Twins and Sisters of Mercy. I used to be a big Nine Inch Nails fan, but I got a little tired of it for 242. Ladytron has been interesting to me recently, although I think the singer always has a snotty attitude in her vocal delivery that I don't like.
Who are those 2 Swedish members?
Amina, and there's 3 women, and they're from Iceland. God!
They're amazing.
Yeah, Amina was really nice. Ian Minogue. So tends to range from goth, industrial to ambient to sort of pretty music like This Mortal Coil and Hope Blister.
Anything like, I guess, like, what do you think of the current state of electronic music or music in general? Like,
Oh, I don't care. I mean, you know, kids today. I used to like be real up on music, but that was the '80s. You know, being totally aware of the cutting edge of cool music is a young man's game. I mean, a young person's game. By the time I was 30, I had pretty much identified how I use music and how I wanted to use music and what it does for me, and it's just a commodity for me now. I found I do still find a lot of stuff that is artistically and emotionally inspiring. You know, like I said, Leibach, for example. I always like Peter Gabriel too in that sense. But I mean, the reality is, most people now, especially in this culture, are listening to a huge amount of music. They might not know they're listening to, but they're exposed to a great deal of music. It's not like 200 years ago when music was an event. Music is just constantly all around you all the time now, usually in tiny little blips. And 97% of the time that you're exposed to music, it's not because you chose to. Music is much, much more commodified now. You're going to have music put on you without asking your permission, against your will, even in some cases, and without any choice on your part. There's sort of middle ground people like me who mostly try to avoid that as much as they can and use the music in a very commodified way in the sense of, well, I'm doing this, so I need to back it up with this kind of sound. But you know, I'll put on, like I said, you know, just a tone for 5 hours if I want to do that. I mean, I looped Brian Eno's Thursday Afternoon album for about 6 months in my bedroom once. It's really, it's a very utilitarian kind of use of music. I think a lot of people are doing that now. It would have been very foreign to someone 200 years ago, as I said. I'm ranging far afield, so I'm going to stop.
I don't know how far afield that is. You know, because you're discussing something that's tantamount to thought pollution.
Tantamount to what?
Thought pollution. That basically
Yes.
our ability to even cognate has been interfered with by the constant result of tones which themselves are utterly dissociated from any sort of creation that they experience. Oftentimes are band limited in very unusual and unrealistic ways, so they create all sorts of strange conflicting fives in our heads, sometimes stepping on top of each other in atonal ways or cross-tonal ways. And or, as you said, it's unstoppable. If one makes the mistake of simply participating in commercial life, then one pretty much has the guarantee that they're going to have something which is going to be turned into an earworm. In other words, something which is like a slogan or some sort of theme or something. And as such, I think it intrudes potentially. I'd like to hear your opinion on this. I already kind of know what I think about it. But,
Well, I think that the thought pollution term is quite apt, especially given how much I believe that music is in fact an unintended side effect of the language system in the brain. Music obviously evokes feelings and ideas, not real accurately. Like, I can play a piece of music that's sad music and it will make most people sad, but not all, and it won't make everyone sad in exactly the same way. Okay? But it still is a cognitively active phenomenon. Music makes people's brains go through fairly sophisticated processes. So I would agree with your term thought pollution. I mean, you get hit with 14 seconds of some crap on hold somewhere, sometimes cycling through several different systems of music on one phone number. If you're foolish enough to allow yourself to be exposed to advertising, well, you're getting hit with zillions of snippets of 10 to 20 seconds long length that are trying to say something. Usually it's being done completely incompetently. I mean, I'm not some kind of conspiracy theorist who believes that there are really smart, effective people out there who are controlling our thoughts with music. That doesn't happen. But nonetheless, you are being affected. It's more like being splattered with goo than manipulated. I think that happens all the time. And so I completely agree with the term thought pollution. And I have cut way back on it in my life. I am exposed to way less junk sound, junk music, and advertising in my life than the average American. Am I done?
We can go on for an hour if you want to be done.
Now, the reason I ask is because I can keep this up all night, and you do not want that.
I think that's plenty. I mean, an hour
Okay.
is plenty.
I
just want to go over it.
awesome. Okay, I'm totally done. Thanks for coming.